The truck roared forward, metal crunching as it plowed through the ornate wrought iron gates. Stunned, Sarah could only watch in horror as her beloved property was destroyed. But this was no accident. The HOA president stood smugly behind the wheel, a sickening grin on her face. Sarah's fight for justice was only just beginning. Sarah stared in disbelief at the twisted, mangled remains of her front gate. This was no accident. The HOA president, Margaret, had intentionally driven the community maintenance truck straight through the ornamental entryway, reducing it to twisted metal and rubble. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Sarah screamed, rushing towards the truck as Margaret climbed out, dusting off her hands with an air of smug satisfaction. "Your gate was an eyesore and a safety hazard," Margaret announced, her shrill voice carrying across the quiet street. "As president of the HOA, I had it removed. You're welcome." "Welcome?" Sarah's voice cracked with rage. "You just destroyed thousands of dollars worth of my property. This was a deliberate act of vandalism." Margaret scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. I was acting in the best interests of the community. Your gate didn't match the approved aesthetic. It had to go." Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, rapidly dialing the police. "I'm reporting you for destruction of private property. You're going to pay for this." Margaret merely rolled her eyes. "Go ahead. The HOA will handle it. You're the one who's going to end up in trouble, not me." As the wail of sirens approached, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. She knew Margaret wasn't bluffing. The HOA had deep pockets and an army of lawyers. This was going to be an uphill battle, but she was determined to fight. The police officers listened intently as Sarah recounted the incident, her voice quivering with emotion. Margaret, on the other hand, stood calmly beside her, offering a polished, rehearsed account of the necessary removal of the gate. The structure was a safety hazard and an eyesore. Margaret insisted, her tone dripping with condescension. "As president of the Homeowners Association, it was my duty to take action." The officers exchanged a skeptical glance, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in their minds. The HOA was a powerful force in the community, and they were unlikely to side against its leadership. "We'll need to investigate further," one of the officers said, his expression guarded. "In the meantime, we suggest you two try to resolve this through the proper channels." As the police car pulled away, Sarah felt her heart sink. She knew that going up against the HOA would be an uphill battle, but she was determined to see it through. "This isn't over, Margaret," she hissed, her eyes narrowed with determination. "I'm going to make you pay for this." Margaret merely chuckled, unperturbed by Sarah's threat. "Good luck with that. The HOA has more resources than you could ever imagine. I'd advise you to tread carefully." With that, Margaret turned on her heel and strode back to her car, leaving Sarah standing amidst the scattered remains of her gate, her mind racing with a plan for revenge. In the days that followed, Sarah pored over the HOA's bylaws, searching for any loophole or technicality that could be used against Margaret and the rest of the association. She knew that they held the power, but she was determined to find a way to level the playing field. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to flaunt her authority, flaunting the HOA's resources and using them to exert her control over the neighborhood. She issued citations for minor infractions, threatened homeowners with fines, and even went so far as to have a neighbor's fence torn down because it didn't meet the community's aesthetic standards. Sarah's frustration boiled over as she watched her neighbors, once a tight-knit community, become divided and fearful of the HOA's wrath. She knew she had to do something, but the more she learned of the association's power, the more daunted she felt. Then, an idea struck her. She would fight fire with fire, using the HOA's own rules and regulations against them. Carefully, she began to document every infraction, every overstep of authority, and every instance of Margaret's abuse of power. As the file grew thicker, Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She was going to take this fight to the HOA's doorstep, and she was going to win. Sarah's determined research paid off when she discovered a glaring violation in the HOA's bylaws. According to the rules, any major structural changes or removals on a homeowner's property required a majority vote from the association's board. Seizing on this technicality, Sarah drafted a formal complaint, meticulously outlining how Margaret had overstepped her authority by unilaterally destroying the gate without approval. She gathered signatures from her neighbors, who were eager to challenge the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. With the complaint in hand, Sarah marched into the next HOA meeting, flanked by a group of disgruntled homeowners. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise as Sarah stood up and addressed the board, her voice clear and unwavering. "This association has overstepped its bounds," Sarah declared. "The unauthorized removal of my gate was a blatant violation of your own bylaws. I'm demanding restitution and a full vote on any future structural changes." The room erupted in a wave of murmurs and protests as Margaret desperately tried to regain control. "This is preposterous," she shrieked. "The gate was an eyesore that needed to be removed." "That's not your decision to make," Sarah shot back, her gaze unwavering. "You will pay to have my gate replaced, and you will hold a proper vote as required by the bylaws." The tension in the room was palpable as the HOA board reluctantly agreed to Sarah's demands. Margaret's face was flushed with fury, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had taken the first step in her fight against the HOA's tyranny. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued to meticulously document every misstep and overreach by the HOA. She attended every meeting, armed with a thick folder of evidence and a steadfast determination to hold the association accountable. Margaret, on the other hand, became increasingly unhinged, lashing out at Sarah and her allies with a venom that shocked the entire community. She accused them of undermining the integrity of the neighborhood and threatened to impose harsh fines and penalties. But Sarah refused to be intimidated. She rallied her neighbors, organizing protests and petition drives that put the HOA under intense public scrutiny. The local media caught wind of the brewing conflict, and soon the story was splashed across the headlines, painting the HOA as a tyrannical organization that prioritized aesthetics over the well-being of its residents. Margaret, realizing that the tide was turning against her, grew increasingly desperate. She attempted to sabotage Sarah's efforts, leaking false information to the press, and even going so far as to file a bogus lawsuit against her. But Sarah was undeterred. She meticulously countered each of Margaret's moves, using the HOA's own rules and regulations against them. With each victory, her confidence grew, and she knew that she was closing in on the final showdown. As the battle raged on, the community became increasingly divided, with some residents siding with the HOA and others rallying behind Sarah's crusade. The tension was palpable, and it was clear that something had to give. The day of the crucial HOA board meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Sarah had spent countless hours preparing her case, armed with a wealth of evidence and a steely determination to finally bring the HOA's abuses to light. As the meeting commenced, Margaret launched into a scathing tirade, accusing Sarah and her allies of stirring up trouble and undermining the very fabric of the community. But Sarah remained unflinching, methodically presenting her evidence and demanding accountability. The room erupted in a cacophony of heated arguments and finger-pointing as the other board members struggled to reconcile their loyalties. Some were swayed by Sarah's compelling case, while others clung to the status quo, unwilling to challenge Margaret's iron-fisted rule. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah made a bold move. She revealed that she had meticulously documented every instance of the HOA's misuse of funds, including questionable expenditures and suspicious money transfers. The board members paled, realizing that their own potential misdeeds were now on the line. Margaret, her face contorted with rage, tried to shout Sarah down, but the damage had been done. The other board members, faced with the prospect of their own complicity being exposed, began to waver in their support for the HOA president. As the meeting devolved into a shouting match, Sarah seized the opportunity to make her final stand. "This association has trampled on the rights of homeowners for far too long," she declared, her voice cutting through the din. "It's time for a change, and I'm not going to stop until justice is served." The room fell silent, and Sarah knew that she had finally gained the upper hand. In the aftermath of the tumultuous HOA meeting, the board members found themselves in a precarious position. Sarah's meticulously documented evidence of financial impropriety had shaken their confidence, and they were now faced with a choice: continue to align themselves with Margaret's increasingly erratic and authoritarian leadership, or embrace the growing calls for reform. Sensing the shifting tides, several board members began to distance themselves from Margaret, recognizing the risks of being associated with her actions. They quietly reached out to Sarah, expressing a willingness to work with her to address the community's concerns and restore a sense of fairness and transparency. Margaret, however, refused to go down without a fight. Furious at the prospect of losing her grip on power, she launched a vicious smear campaign against Sarah, using the HOA's resources to paint her as a troublemaker and a threat to the community. But Sarah refused to be cowed. She took her fight to the public, holding press conferences and organizing neighborhood forums to expose the HOA's abuses and garner support for her cause. The more Margaret lashed out, the more sympathy Sarah garnered from her fellow homeowners, who were increasingly fed up with the association's heavy-handed tactics. As the conflict escalated, the local media became increasingly invested in the story, with reporters digging into the HOA's finances and uncovering even more instances of mismanagement and corruption. The pressure on the board members mounted, and they found themselves torn between their loyalty to Margaret and the growing demand for accountability. In the end, it was the threat of legal action and the prospect of public humiliation that finally forced the HOA board's hand. Faced with the possibility of a costly and highly publicized lawsuit, they reluctantly agreed to a series of reforms, including the replacement of the gate, the implementation of stricter financial controls, and the establishment of a more inclusive and transparent decision-making process. As the dust settled, Sarah stood as the undisputed victor in her battle against the HOA. The replacement of her beloved gate, paid for by the association, was a symbolic triumph, a tangible reminder of the power of perseverance and the willingness to stand up against injustice. But the true victory lay in the profound changes that had swept through the community. The HOA, once a bastion of unchecked authority, had been brought to heel, its members forced to embrace a new era of accountability and transparency. Margaret, the once untouchable HOA president, had been unceremoniously stripped of her power, forced to resign amidst a cloud of shame and scandal. Her downfall, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of collective action, sent a clear message to all those who would seek to abuse their position of authority. As Sarah walked the streets of her neighborhood, she could sense a palpable shift in the air. The once divided community had come together, united in the belief that they could make a difference, that they could stand up to the bullies and the tyrants who sought to control their lives. It was a bittersweet moment, tinged with the scars of a hard-fought battle, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had stood her ground, never wavering in the face of adversity, and in doing so, she had shown her neighbors that they had the power to reclaim their community, to build the kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in. In the end, it wasn't just about the gate, or even the HOA's misdeeds. It was about something much deeper, a fundamental belief in the right to self-determination and the willingness to fight for it, no matter the cost. And for Sarah, that was a victory worth celebrating.